Hi, I'm Bruce Eckel,
I'm James Ward.
and this is First Steps in Flex. Now we're going to be looking at components. And components are a really fundamental part of Flex. Many languages are object-oriented, but if you go one step further, you get component-oriented. And that means you have other features on top of just being object-oriented. In particular, you've got messaging and events.
Yep, and this gives us, much more than just a framework for building objects, really for building UIs, because we have all the different pieces that we need to build UIs when we actually have real components.
And the basic thing when you're dealing with an object-oriented language is an object, but with Flex, the basic thing that you manipulate and throw around is the component.
Especially when you're doing creating the visual aspects of a Flex application.
Right.
When you're just creating value objects and passing data around, then you're just doing plain old objects.
Right. So I guess there's a number of different ways we can create these components. We've been using the components so far. We've just been sticking buttons and things. That's a component.
Ones that are just out-of-the-box Flex components.
Right. So what we're going to look at in this chapter is how to write your own components. And there's a number of different ways to do that. And the first way we want to look at is just using MXML inline. We're just going to do the simplest possible way that you can create a component.
So let's go ahead and create a new project here in Flex Builder. We'll call it Components. And we'll call this one Inline Components to be in line with the names in the book. And just hit Finish. So now in this Flex project, what we're going to do is first just add a component like you've seen done already. And before we do that, let's go take out the layout absolute. We don't need that in this particular one. And so now let's go add a component. In this case, let's add a button. So it's just a plain old button. We're going to set the label property on this button to button instance.
So this is the kind of thing we've been doing
Exactly.
so far.
That's just a plain old button, just creating an instance of that object or component. So now let's actually create a new custom component that will be based on the button component. And we'll talk in a little bit about the component hierarchy
and you put this first button in just for comparison. It's not. We don't have to have it.
We don't
for
have
that.
that.
Okay.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to create an mx::component tag. And so what this is going to allow us to do is create what's called an inline component. And there's many different ways to create these custom components, and we'll go through those later on in this screencast. So we're going to specify a property on this called class name. And so now is here where we actually specify the name, the object name for our custom component. So we'll say my button. And then now inside of this component is where we actually define the object that we're going to be basing our custom component on. So in this case, it's going to be just a button. So we're creating a new component that's based on button.
So when you say based on, that's really, in object-oriented parlance, we'd call this inheritance, right?
Yep, exactly.
So, and inheritance means that just like if your uncle dies, you get all of his stuff if you inherit his stuff.
That's right.
Okay, so we're inheriting from button, so my button is going to get all the stuff from button.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Now, am I limited? Can I put more than one base class for?
So because this mx::component tag is really kind of like an inner class or just a wrapper around a class, we can only have one top level MXML definition in this mx::component. So we can only inherit from one class at a time.
Is that just because we're using MXML, or is that just a general rule?
That's in general. Yeah.
Okay.
So
single inheritance.
Single inheritance.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we're going to override a property on this button. We could also create our own custom properties, but in this case we're just going to override the fill colors property and set this to, let's create a nice gradient here from red to yellow. And so that's our custom button. Pretty basic. We could have gone a lot further to really customize this button. And the place where we'd want to create a custom component like this, rather than just setting those those properties or those styles manually on an instance of a button is we're going to be frequently reusing this component, and we don't want to have to continually have to set these properties or add these things onto this custom component. We just want to be able to reuse a higher level component. So in this case, we're setting fill colors. Okay, so now I'm going to go and create a new instance of this myButton component. So that's a custom class that we created, custom component based on button. So to do that, first thing I need to do is let Flex know about how to find this component. So we do that through namespaces, and we'll talk more about those in just a second. But what I'm going to do is set up a namespace, and we'll let you know what that means in a few minutes. But now I can actually go and add the my button. You'll notice that the code completion isn't working right now, and I think that's a bug in the version of Flex Builder that we have, so I think that's fixed in newer versions. But we're going to go and set some properties here. We're going to say my button instance. There we go. So now what we've actually done is created an instance of this custom component. So a lot of times in an MX application, everything that's kind of defined in code in the application is something that it visually appears in the application. In this case, the MX component tag doesn't actually visually appear inside the application. Only things that we create instances of in the application will show up. And so we're going to have two buttons displayed. The first one is based on this custom myButton, and that will have the fill colors from red to yellow, and then we'll have a second button that's just the plain old button. So now let's save this and run it and see what it looks like. So there we go. We get our buttons. So two buttons, both function just like regular buttons, but the top one is our custom button.
Good enough, except we kind of rushed over the namespaces stuff. And there's some weird things in it, like my button doesn't have a leading, well, everything else has MX colon, which I can see at the top after application. I can see here, this looks like it's defining the namespace MX to be something to do with Adobe, whereas this other one doesn't look like it's defining anything. So I'm guessing maybe that's why my button doesn't need anything in
prefix
front of it,
yep,
because
yep,
this is...
That's exactly right.
Okay. So tell me a little bit more about namespaces then.
Yeah, so the namespaces, all that they really do is associate a package of classes or components with a XML prefix. And so what we're seeing here with XML namespace colon MX. MX is then our prefix that we can use on this tag and any children tags within this tag as a prefix that then refer to some set of components. And so you can refer to sets of components in two ways. The first way is through using URLs. And when someone creates a library in Flex or a SWIC file in Flex, they define, they can define if they want to, a URL that references a number of different components. And so that's what is happening here, is that the MX prefix is being associated with this, this could be really anything. It doesn't have to be a URL. It's not actually doing any lookups to adobe.com. All that this is some global unique identifier that says any components that are in our component library path in our project that have this namespace can be instantiated through the MX prefix, or through the prefix that we've defined here.
Okay, now in the languages that I've used, one of the primary goals of namespaces is so that you can use whatever names you want and not worry about colliding with names in other namespaces.
Right.
So that would suggest that we could actually call our new component button as well, and because it's in a different namespace, we should be able to use it without worrying about colliding.
We absolutely could. Yep. And
let's try that.
Even try that. So let's change our class name to button, and then change that to button. And now let's see if we get any compilers. Definition button could not be found. So it's telling us that it can't resolve a multi-name reference.
Is that because we're using
unambiguously.
this unspecified namespace over here with no, instead of MX,
I believe that when we get to defining components in ActionScript, that this will actually work fine. I think that what's happening is that this is essentially becoming an additional class file, and it's probably getting the imports from its wrapper application, so it's being assigned a bunch of imports, and that's why it's ambiguous. Whereas when we define this in an ActionScript class, as opposed to in an mx::component tag, then we won't have this collision.
Okay, so most of the time you're not gonna. I mean, we're just doing this for simplicity and an example, but most of the time you're probably not going to do this unless, say, you wanted to make some quick little shorthand within an application. You might use this technique.
Right. The place where the mx::component tag is mostly used is in item renderers. So we actually have a chapter later on item renderers, and we will actually there use the mx::component tag to define an inline item renderer. An item renderer has to be a component. It can't be because it gets reused. And so we have to be able to create instances of this item renderer in a list or something like that. And so that's where mx::component is most used.
But typically, if we're going to create our own component, we're probably going to put it outside of our application rather than defining it inline.
Right. Yeah.
So can we see an example of that? Maybe we can take this and define it in an external
MXML let's do that in a minute. I want to go through a little bit more on namespaces.
Okay.
So one of the things here is that you notice that, as you pointed out, Bruce, that this one doesn't have a prefix defined. There was no colon, whatever. And so what that means is that if there is no prefix, then associate with whatever namespace is defined here. So I talked about URLs and how we can use URLs to associate to a package of components. But here I have a star. And what star here means is actually reference any classes that are in the base level package, the default package, where we haven't defined a package. If we had defined a package, then I could say, foo.star, and then my class name would be foo.mybutton. And so then foo.star, so this namespace would refer to any classes in the foo package. So that's two different ways that you can set up the namespaces. You can either create a custom library and specify the classes being used through the URL that library was created with, or you can use the package syntax. We could even set up. So this namespace URL has a lot of the out of the box Flex components in it, most of them actually. But you could even set up a namespace that would reference specific packages within Flex. So if you wanted to set up a new XML namespace, call it controls or something like that, we could set that equal to mx.controls.star. And button is actually in the controls mx.controls package. So we could even come down here and change this out to controls. And now this should compile. Oop, we messed up my button there. Let's go back. So now that works as well. So that's just a different way. But the interesting thing about doing URLs instead of the packages is that with the URLs we can put multiple packages inside of a single namespace. Whereas with this one we would have to define a ton of these mx: namespaces in order to get to all the Flex classes that we may want to use in a given project. Okay, so then one other thing here, we can also create the custom namespaces. So we can create XML namespace foo, specify that, and instead of my button down here alone, we put the foo prefix in front of it.
So here probably button would work then.
It may, yeah. So we'll try that when we move on to the custom class file. So let's do that now. So we've seen all the different ways here to define these custom components. So now let's go in and actually create show a different way other than mx::component to create a new component. So to do that, what we're actually going to do is I'm going to create a new MXML class. So there's two different ways that we can define our custom components. As you've seen here, we can define them in MXML. We can also define them in MXML using by separating out that component into a separate class file. So what we can do here is say my button MXML. And then it's going to ask me here in Flex Builder, what do I want to base it on?
And that's the base class?
That's my base class. So in this case, I'm going to say button is your base class. And so now I get a custom MXML class file. So this is actually a class. And the root tag, as I mentioned before, is the class that we're extending. And so now I can just set any properties I want to on this button.
And in the book, we remove that first
line.
Yeah.
So we can close that down, and it doesn't necessarily have to be open.
The top line.
Oh, which one?
The very top.
Oh, the XML.
Line.
Yep. That's not necessary.
Okay.
As well. Okay. So now on our MX button, let's specify just one simple property here. Let's specify the fill colors to be blue. So now we're just going to tell it to this custom.
So now what's the name of this new component now?
The name is, if you define a component in MXML, the name of the class or component is the file name.
Ah, I see.
So
now when we want to use that, all we have to do is give the file name.
Yep. So let's go do that. Let's go back into our main application.
So that means I can only have one component per file?
Yep.
So
that's
it's
right.
like Java that way then.
Yep. Yep. So now let's go add, and now we actually get the code hinting. You'll see it's using my foo prefix because I left that in there, and it will auto complete that. So now we get my button MXML, and then we can set the label. We'll call it my button MXML instance, and save it. And let's go run this one. Make sure that you run the actual application, not the component. So now we see our button there with the blue fill, and so each of these are just instances of different components. So then we can create MXML components as many as we want. We can base them on any base class that we want to. One thing that I do want to show is how do we determine what the base classes are and how to use them. I think we showed this trick in an earlier video, but we'll show it again. If you go into a component and hit Shift F2, it'll actually take you into the documentation for that component. And what we'll see is the inheritance hierarchy of that particular control. So here we see the package is mx.controls, the class is button, and now we actually see the inheritance hierarchy all the way down to object. We see any interfaces that it implements and any classes that the subclass button or inherit from button. So that's a great way to see how the components in Flex work. What properties you can set on them and the inheritance hierarchy there.
So this seems useful, be able to define it in an external file, but it also I think one of the things we've discovered is MXML doesn't have the kind of fine-tuning fiddly stuff that you get when you drop into ActionScript.
That's right.
So how would we define this in ActionScript?
Yeah, so let's create a new component, this time defined in ActionScript. So most components are actually written, most hardcore components are written in ActionScript. So anytime you really get into custom component development, you're probably at some point going to create the components in ActionScript because you get so much more flexibility, you get unit testability, there's just things that you just can't do in the declarative world. And so let's go create a new ActionScript class. So when we create the ActionScript component, we're just going to create an ActionScript class. And we can put it in a package if we want to. We'll just leave it in the default package. We'll give it a name. This is the class name, myButtonAS. And then the superclass is going to be button. And we can make sure that we get the right one there. mx.controls.button is what we want. We can implement any interfaces.
Now, why does it say use of default packages discouraged?
It wants us to put in a package. We don't have to do it. Yeah, so we
so in general, you don't want to do that, but in our example, we just wanted to keep things simple.
Right.
Okay.
So now we get our ActionScript class, and so this is very similar to this, except that one is defined in ActionScript and one is defined in MXML. And in the ActionScript one, we can do the same thing that we did in the MXML one. So in our constructor, let's go in and call this .setStyle. So different syntax here to set style in ActionScript than in MXML. In MXML, we could just set the style directly. So we could just set the fill color style. Here we have to actually call the set style method, pass it the fill colors name, and then give it what we want to set it to. So in this case, let's set it to green.
Now, I don't know if we've actually introduced the constructor before. Notice that it has the same name as the name of the class, so it's like C++ that way.
Yep, these have to match, and there's no return type.
No return type,
and it has to be public.
It is automatically called whenever you create an instance of MyButtonAS.
Yep.
And notice that the first call is to super, which calls the base class constructor, in this case is buttons constructor.
Yep.
And you virtually always want to call the base class constructor as the first thing, so that the base class is all constructed by the time you do anything to it. Otherwise, if we were to call this .setStyle before super, chances are it wouldn't work.
It would probably blow up because something had not been
initialized. The base class doesn't get initialized, and so you wouldn't be setting the style of anything.
Right.
So.
Great. Okay, so let's save that one. And now that one's saved, let's go back into our main application, and let's add yet again another instance of a button. In this case, it's going to be MyButtonAS, and we'll set the label to MyButtonAS instance, and save that. And as you would expect, we can actually just go refresh here. Now we get our green button.
Oh, yes.
So many different ways to create these components, inline components, MXML components defined in separate classes, and ActionScript classes that extend our base component classes as well.
Now, did we talk about the package keyword?
We didn't. Yeah. So let's actually move this into a package. So to move it, what we can do is I'm going to go just create a new folder. So just like in many other object-oriented languages, our classes have to be in a folder directory for the package that they're in. So let's go create our package foo, and then go change this to be package foo. So what this is just doing is putting this class into the package foo.
And so this is like Java, where you have to have, the name of your package has to be the name of the directory that it's in. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. And the class name has to also match the class name there.
Name of the file. Yeah.
So you'll notice that I got an error now saying that it can't resolve foo : MyButtonAS. And that's because this namespace foo only refers to classes in the default package. So if we wanted to reference the MyButtonAS, we'd have to add a new XML namespace for that one. And we can do that in a few different ways. One way is just to set it down here on this thing. We can just come in and set the XML namespace to foo.star. There we go. And save that. And now all that it's saying is, again, no prefix and no prefix there, matches classes in the foo package.
How would you do it more generally so that you didn't have to repeat that every time?
Yeah, so this when you define the XML namespace here, it defines for that component instance and any children of that one. If we wanted to do that more generically, we could just move it up here into the top level application. And this is probably a little confusing because now I'm using the foo prefix for star and using the no prefix for the foo package.
But it seems to be figuring it out.
It is figuring out because it's just associating no prefix to foo.star package and the foo prefix to the default package.
Okay. All right. Well, that seems like we've covered the basics of creating components now.
And that's definitely the basics. There is a lot more you can do with custom components. If you see some of the more amazing Flex components out there, if you're looking through Tour de Flex or just find Flex components, you'll see that they have a lot of stuff going on. And in order to really get that level of complexity, you have to make your component participate in the Flex component lifecycle. And that's a rather complex beast to get to know. There's uses lots of invalidation and sorts of things to make the whole component model work. And so as you get into complex component development, you have to understand that life cycle and understand how to make your component participate in that for things like resizing and setting properties and styles and those sorts of things. So that is documented very well in the Flex documentation and numerous other places out of the scope of our book.
All right, great.